May 1945. Berlin was burning. The Third Reich had collapsed. In the streets of the German capital, Russian soldiers were dancing on the ruins of the Reichstag. American were shaking hands with Soviet troops at the Elbe River, sharing cigarettes and vodka. The world was celebrating. The nightmare was over. The tyranny of Adolf Hitler had been crushed. But amidst the champagne and the cheering, one man was not smiling. General George S. Patton walked through the ruins of Germany, and he didn't see a victory. He saw a catastrophe in the making. While politicians in Washington and London were toasting their Soviet allies, expecting a new era of global peace, Patton was looking at the Red Army with cold, predator eyes. He saw their tanks. He saw their discipline, or lack thereof. And most importantly, he saw their intentions. To the horror of his superiors, Patton began saying the unspeakable. He told General Eisenhower, he told the press, and he told anyone who would listen to him in the ruined officers' clubs of Bavaria. We may have kicked the hell out of the Germans, but we defeated the wrong enemy. Patton believed that World War II was only half over. He believed that the United States had destroyed one monster only to create a bigger, hungrier one. And he had a plan. A terrifying, secret plan that would have changed the course of human history. He didn't want to demobilize. He didn't want to send the boys home to their wives and mothers. He wanted to rearm the defeated German Wehrmacht, combine them with his unstoppable Third Army, and drive east. He wanted to push the Red Army back to the borders of Russia before they became strong enough to threaten the world. History calls this madness. Patton called it survival. This is the story of the war that never happened, and the mysterious death of the only man who wanted to fight it. To understand why Patton wanted to start World War III before the smoke had cleared from World War II, we have to look at what he saw in the summer of 1945. Patton was not a politician. He was a warrior historian. He believed in the cycles of history, and he knew that nature abhors a vacuum. With Germany destroyed, the buffer zone of Europe was gone. There was nothing standing between the Soviet Union and the Atlantic Ocean except a few tired American divisions that were packing their bags to go home. Patton watched as Stalin's forces didn't just liberate Eastern Europe. They swallowed it. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. He saw the Iron Curtain descending long before Winston Churchill ever coined the phrase. Patton wrote in his diary a chilling observation. Russia knows what she wants: world domination, and she is laying the stakes for it immediately. His hatred for the Soviets was visceral. He despised their communism, which he saw as a direct threat to Western civilization and individual liberty. But he also despised their military conduct. As his Third Army moved deeper into Europe, they encountered the aftermath of the Red Army's advance. They saw the looting, the chaos, and the brutality inflicted upon civilians. To a man like Patton, who prized discipline and order, who had famously returned a pistol to a German general as a sign of professional respect, the Soviet method of war was barbaric. He saw them not as a modern army, but as a horde from the steppes, a force of chaos that had to be contained. But there was also a tactical urgency to his madness. In 1945, the United States possessed two things the Soviets did not. First, the atomic bomb. Second, the most powerful mechanized air force the world had ever seen. Patton argued that the U.S. Army was at its absolute peak. They were already in Europe. They were battle-hardened. Their supply lines were established. The Soviets, while numerous, were exhausted. They had lost 20 million people. Their infrastructure was shattered. Their supply lines were overextended, and reliant on American trucks and American steel. Patton believed that the window of opportunity was closing fast. He urged his superiors, "We can beat the hell out of them now, but in 5 years, they will have the bomb. They will rebuild their industry, and it will be too late." He begged Eisenhower to let him keep his Third Army intact. He famously whispered a proposal that sounded like treason to the politicians in Washington. He said, "Keep the Germans armed. Keep the panzer divisions ready. Let me lead them. I'll make it look like the Russians provoked us. Give me the green light, and I'll drive them back to the Volga River." Imagine the scenario. American Sherman tanks fighting alongside German Tiger tanks, American P-47 Thunderbolts, flying cover for German infantry. It was a concept so radical, so unthinkable, that it terrified the Allied command more than Hitler ever had. But Washington didn't want another war. The American public was tired. They had sacrificed enough. They wanted their sons back. They wanted to buy cars, build houses, and enjoy the economic boom of peace. They didn't want to fight in the snow of Russia for countries they couldn't find on a map. General Eisenhower, the supreme pragmatist and future president, was horrified by Patton's rhetoric. He saw Patton not as a visionary, but as a loose cannon who was going to start a diplomatic crisis. Eisenhower ordered Patton to shut up. He stripped Patton of his beloved Third Army, the army he had built into the greatest fighting force in history, and placed him in charge of a paper army, the 15th Army. It was a desk job, a humiliation. They put the legendary general in timeout, hoping he would fade away into retirement. They underestimated George Patton. He did not go quietly. He continued to speak out. He criticized the denazification process, arguing that completely destroying the German administrative structure and infrastructure would only make the country ripe for Soviet takeover. He argued that we were tearing down the only people who knew how to run the country, leaving a vacuum for communism to fill. The press, who had once hailed him as a hero, turned on him. They labeled him a warmonger. They called him soft on Nazis. The politicians ostracized him. Patton became a man alone, a prophet of doom screaming into the wind. He fell into a deep depression. He wrote letters to his wife Beatrice, filled with dark premonitions. He felt that his destiny was being denied. He told his family, "I am destined to die by the accident of a horse or a car. I have survived the wars only to be killed by peace." And then, the strange events of December 1945 occurred. Events that, to this day, fuel conspiracy theories and whispers in the darkest corners of military history. On December 8, 1945, Patton's chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, invited him on a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim, Germany. It was a cold, misty Sunday morning. Patton was in a foul mood, restless and bored with his administrative duties. He sat in the back of his 1938 Cadillac Model 75 staff car. General Gay sat next to him. Driving the car was Private First Class Horace Woodring. Following them was another Jeep with a hunting dog. At approximately 11:45 a.m., the Cadillac was driving north on a straight stretch of road. Suddenly, a chaotic scene unfolded. A 2.5-ton U.S. Army GMC truck, driven by Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson, turned abruptly across the road, heading for a roadside depot. The Cadillac had no time to stop. Woodring slammed on the brakes, but the heavy staff car skidded and slammed into the truck's fuel tank at a relatively low speed, estimated to be only about 20 miles per hour. It was a fender bender, a minor accident. The drivers were unhurt. General Gay was unhurt. The dog in the following Jeep was unhurt. But inside the Cadillac, General George Patton was paralyzed. He had been thrown forward, his head striking the glass partition behind the driver's seat, shattering his neck vertebrae. He lay in the back of the car, unable to move his arms or legs, whispering, "I think I'm paralyzed." He was rushed to a hospital in Heidelberg. For 12 days he lay in a hospital bed, kept alive by traction devices. Doctors from across the Allied world flew in. There were moments of hope, moments where it seemed the old warrior might pull through. But on December 21, 1945, General George S. Patton died in his sleep of a pulmonary embolism. The official report called it an unfortunate automobile accident. Just bad luck. But almost immediately, the questions began. And they haven't stopped for 80 years. Why was the accident so minor, yet the injury so severe? Why did the truck driver Robert Thompson vanish from the records shortly after? Why were there reports of a missing file regarding the accident in the National Archives? And most chillingly, who benefited the most from Patton's death? There are those who believe that Patton was silenced. The theories range from the plausible to the wild. Some historians and former intelligence officers have suggested that the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, ordered the hit. They knew Patton was rallying support for a war against Russia. They knew he was the only Western general with the will and the charisma to lead such a fight. Eliminating him removed the biggest obstacle to Soviet expansion in Europe. Other, darker theories suggest that the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, might have been involved. Did the American government decide that Patton was too dangerous to live? That his loud mouth and his desire for war would drag the United States into a nuclear conflict that the world couldn't survive? We may never know the truth. The files are lost, the witnesses are dead, and history has moved on. But what we do know is that Patton's death marked the end of an era and the beginning of another. The Hot War ended, and the Cold War began. And almost everything Patton predicted came true. Within 3 years of his death, the Soviets blockaded Berlin. Within 4 years, they detonated their own atomic bomb, thanks to spies within the Manhattan Project. Within 5 years, American soldiers were dying in Korea, fighting communist forces supplied by the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain that Patton saw falling in 1945 stayed shut for 45 years. Millions of people in Eastern Europe lived under totalitarian rule. The world lived under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The United States spent trillions of dollars on a Cold War that might have been fought and won in 1945 if Patton had been given his way. Or perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps an attack on Russia in 1945 would not have resulted in a quick victory, but in a never-ending slaughter across the frozen vastness of Eurasia. Perhaps it would have destroyed the moral standing of the United States. Perhaps the exhaustion of the world was too great to bear another day of fighting. We cannot judge the roads not taken. We can only look at the history we have. But one thing is certain. George S. Patton was a man out of time. He was a gladiator born into a world of diplomats. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, good and evil, friend and enemy. When the enemy changed from the swastika to the hammer and sickle, he didn't blink. He simply reloaded. He was the ultimate warrior, and in the end, peace was the only thing that could kill him. Today, Patton lies buried in Luxembourg, at the Ham American Cemetery. He requested to be buried there, amidst his men. He didn't want to be buried in Arlington with the politicians and the desk generals. He wanted to lie with the soldiers of the Third Army who fell during the Battle of the Bulge. If you visit his grave, you will see it stands at the head of the formation, facing his troops, as if he is ready to lead them one last time. In the quiet of that cemetery, looking out over the rows of white crosses, One can't help but wonder, what if? What if the Jeep hadn't crashed? What if Eisenhower had said yes? What if the tanks had kept rolling east? Would we be living in a better world or a radioactive wasteland? That is the enigma of George Patton. He was the hero who saved Europe and the dangerous visionary who wanted to burn it down again to save it. He remains the most controversial, the most brilliant, and the most frightening general America ever produced. And his warning from the ruins of 1945 still echoes today. We defeated the wrong enemy. Whether he was a prophet or a madman, that is for history to decide.